弟兄姊妹早晨，今日係2022年嘅第一個主日，喺度呢，就祝願大家新年快樂，身體健康。讓我哋呢都係懷著一個感恩嘅心去數算神喺2021年俾我哋嘅恩典。不如我哋同身邊嘅弟兄姊妹講聲新年快樂，好唔好啊？新年快樂！
新年快樂！
好啦，讓我哋一同起立，去讚頌我哋呢位充滿恩典、信實嘅神。
天天歌唱，頌讚神慈恩，讚嘆宇宙萬千的奧秘，多高深承受運行原理，神造物無限勢力。歌唱未怕迎狂風，有你結伴每刻恩典夠用，邁步浪裏衝，何妨澎湃洶湧。你護送神啊，我感激恩手永不曾離開，讚嘆再造後人不可替代，萬事盡放開，前程由你主宰，永沒變改。神啊，我感激恩手永不曾離開，讚嘆再造後人不可替代，萬事盡放開，前程由你主宰，你是愛。天天歌唱，天天歌唱，頌讚神慈恩，讚嘆宇宙萬千的奧秘，多高深承受運行原理，神造物無限勢力。天天歌唱未怕迎狂風，有你結伴每刻恩典夠用，邁步浪裏衝，何妨澎湃洶湧。你護送神啊，我感激恩手永不曾離開，讚嘆再造後人不可替代，萬事盡放開，前程由你主宰，永沒變改。神啊，我感激恩手永不曾離開，讚嘆再造後人不可替代，萬事盡放開，前程由你主宰，你是愛。神啊，我感激恩手永不曾離開，讚嘆再造後人不可替代，萬事盡放開，前程由你主宰，永沒變改。神啊，我感激恩手永不曾離開，讚嘆再造後人不可替代，萬事盡放開，前程由你主宰，你是愛。神啊，我感激恩手永不曾離開，讚嘆再造後人不可替代，萬事盡放開，前程由你主宰，永沒變改。神啊，我感激恩手永不曾離開，讚嘆再造後人不可替代，萬事盡放開，前程由你主宰，你是愛。
感謝神，讓我哋有生命氣息。喺2021年，我哋再一次經歷到疫情嘅反覆，疫情嘅影響，好似一浪接一浪咁樣冚埋嚟。當中可能我哋會有憂心，有難過，但係神嘅愛，佢嘅恩典都係保護我哋渡過每一個嘅難關。我哋只要願意將我哋嘅生命完完全全咁樣交俾佢，都知道佢係從歲首到年終都係咁愛我哋嘅神。
我的心裏投靠 主，我因主。投靠你的必不致羞愧，投靠你的定必找到方向，為這一生好處找得到地址。頌讚尊貴耶穌，恩典一生一世，飽享恩主的愛，世上無可尋。頌讚尊貴耶穌，根基不致動搖，天天與你共行，我感恩。從歲首到年終，你恩惠無窮，我天天的仰望，你天天的抱擁。從歲首到年終，你保守看顧，每天恩典重，使我獻奉最真感恩祭。
我的心裏投靠主，
我的心裏投靠主，我因主。投靠你的必不致羞愧，投靠你的定必找到方向，為這一生好處找得到地址。頌讚尊貴耶穌，恩典一生一世，飽享恩主的愛，世上無可尋。頌讚尊貴耶穌，根基不致動搖，天天與你共行，我感恩。從歲首到年終，你恩惠無窮，我天天的仰望，你天天的抱擁。從歲首到年終，你保守看顧，每天恩典重，使我獻奉最真感恩祭。從歲首到年終，你恩惠無窮，我天天的仰望，你天天的抱擁。從歲首到年終，你保守看顧，每天恩典重，使我獻奉最真感恩祭。你恩典豐富極深厚，每天保守，每一刻供應是足夠，夜深和白晝，頌讚你，讓我生命改變，每刻在恩典。頌讚你，萬世千載不變，身心皆奉獻。你施恩普世出天雨，傾 伏於世間，細心的把我再看顧，關心無間，憐憫我，讓我生命改變，愛心一倍添，願靠你面對新的挑戰，身心皆奉獻。
感謝你，你嘅保護，你嘅保守。雖然喺過去一年，我哋面對咗好多嘅挑戰，可能我哋會有失望嘅時候，但係都知道主你永遠都同我哋喺埋一齊。喺我哋需要你嘅時候，你都會幫我哋。你俾足夠我哋去度過每一日嘅生活，讓我哋都係數算你嘅恩典，因為藉着你嘅犧牲，改變咗我哋嘅生命，讓我哋都帶着呢個感恩嘅心，去再唱呢詩歌一次。你恩典豐富極深厚，
你恩典豐富極深厚，每天保守，每一刻供應是足夠，夜深和白晝，
頌讚你，
頌讚你，讓我生命改變，每刻在恩獻，頌讚你，萬世千載不變，身心皆奉獻，
憐憫我，
憐憫我，讓我生命改變，愛心一倍添，願靠你面對新的挑戰，身心皆奉獻。
讓我哋都同佢祈禱。主啊，感謝你，感謝你喺過去一年你嘅帶領，你嘅保守，我哋都經歷到你嘅大愛，你嘅恩典。縱然係有好多挑戰，有好多困難，我哋都知道你係喺我哋嘅生命裏邊，你就係嗰位從歲首到年終都係保護我哋嘅神。你喺十字架上面犧牲，令到我哋有盼望，我哋活嘅每一日都係唔同，讓我哋都係帶住一個信心，同你一同去同行。雖然嚟緊呢一年可能會有更加多嘅未知嘅可能性，又或者有更加多嘅困難，但我哋都相信聖靈係會喺我哋生命裏邊去帶領住我哋，牽引住我哋，保護住我哋。感謝你，讓我哋嘅靈，我哋嘅心都時時刻刻去讚美你，歌頌你嘅名。禱告係奉靠我哋救主耶穌基督名祈求，阿門。好，大家請坐。
我哋感謝咧敬拜小組帶領我哋有好好嘅詩歌。雖然咧不斷遇到咧環境嘅轉變啊，同埋挑戰， 咁但係咧，神嘅恩典咧夠用，神咧必定咧同我哋一齊，就好似詩歌所講，佢會帶領我哋讓我哋嘅生命咧能夠繼續成長。咁咧，我哋有一啲嘅代禱咁首先呢，就因為近日我哋嗰個確診嘅數字啦，即係雪梨不斷暴漲啦、暴增咁紀念到咧教牧團咧喺嚟緊星期三其實星期三咧係我哋即係教牧團嘅會議咁我哋教牧團咧係會決定喺教會裏邊咧我哋新一輪嘅一啲防疫嘅措施，咁同埋咧過去嗰幾日咧特別過去呢兩日咁都收到消息啦，咁我哋都好不幸地知道有肢體咧，即係有弟兄姊妹咧係確診，咁另外咧有一啲咧係成為咗密切嘅接觸者，而家喺度隔離緊嘅，咁我哋都去紀念佢哋嘅身體啦。咁另外咧亦都係紀念我哋嘅灑水系統工程仍然咧係會按原定嘅計劃咧去進行嘅，咁都係求神保守啦。咁仲有就係我哋嘅組堂委員會議喺呢個星期四呢，我哋係會有網上嘅會議舉行嘅，咁亦都係求神帶領我哋一齊咧去為呢啲嘅需要咧嚟到去祈禱。親愛嘅天父上帝，你係我哋嘅主，我哋喺耶穌基督嘅裏邊，我哋有永生嘅盼望，我哋嘅好處不在你以外。為着近日嘅疫情，我哋切切禱告仰望你嘅恩典。你嘅憐憫，知道受新冠病毒感染而入院嘅人數呢係不斷提升，求主憐憫保守所有嘅醫護人員，令所有呢無論係有受病毒感染或者係往常住院嘅病人，佢哋都可以得到妥善嘅跟進同埋醫治。我哋亦知道有肢體確診感染咗新冠病毒，同埋因為佢哋係成為咗密切接觸者，需要隔離嘅弟兄姊妹。主，我哋去求你賜俾佢哋有平安，讓佢哋好好休息，加俾佢哋力量同埋信心去面對逆境，同埋早日康復。主，我哋為着灑水系統嘅安裝，我哋去禱告。大堂嘅工程、落基堂嘅工程期間呢，我哋嘅場地嘅運用會受到限制。賜俾我哋有忍耐，特別係期盼工程完成嘅心，讓工作人員佢哋可以安全嘅進行所有嘅安裝。同時呢，我哋亦都喺工程嘅裏邊，亦都牽涉到落基堂設施嘅一啲嘅安排嘅時候，主啊，求你都賜俾我哋教牧，我哋執事有好嘅共識。主啊，我哋亦都喺新嘅一年，我哋求主繼續帶領粵語堂行喺你嘅旨意嘅裏邊。願意我哋眾弟兄姊妹，我哋嘅生命同埋靈性不斷嘅成長。我哋紀念到呢個星期四，我哋組堂委員嘅會議。神啊，我哋求你讓各委員能夠謙卑同埋合一嘅去商討嘅計劃同埋一啲嘅事工。神啊，我哋感謝你垂聽我哋嘅禱告，係奉耶穌基督嘅名求。阿門。咁咧喺整個1月份呢，咁教牧團呢係會以一個嘅講道嘅系列即係1月份嘅時候就係上帝使用唔完美嘅人作為呢我哋嗰個講道系列。咁今日呢，有我哋嘅主任牧師簡廸明牧師呢嚟到去開始我哋嘅第一講。咁呢佢所選用嘅人物呢係以斯帖。咁簡牧師呢，佢係會直接咧喺佢嘅講道嘅裏邊呢去引述今日所要用嘅經文。咁我哋都有彭爾德醫生呢嚟到係去做我哋嘅傳譯。
Morning, everybody, and Happy New Year.
各位早晨，新年快樂！
Sometimes There are persons from a very human perspective are never identified as being likely to be successful, but who end up accomplishing great things.
好多時喺人嘅角度嚟睇咧，有啲人可能咧係永遠都唔會成功嘅，但係結果咧佢哋成就咗大事。
I personally know such people who God has used despite their apparent weaknesses and their limitations.
我個人都識啲咁嘅人咧，佢哋雖然係軟弱無能、冇乜本事嘅，但係神都使用佢哋嘅。
Yet many of us live with feelings of inadequacy that limit to what we are open to what God might be doing in our lives.
我哋好多人覺得自己都係冇乜本事咧，就限制咗神喺我哋生命裏邊要做嘅嘢。
Maybe we feel inadequate in managing our finances.
可能你覺得自己管理財務唔係咁好。
Or maybe you're a student and you work so hard and you only get passes and credits while your friends get distinctions and high distinctions.
又可能你好勤力讀書咧，但係只係僅合格嘅，而你啲朋友咧好容易就攞到 high 丁啊、優等嘅級數。
Or it could be in your parenting or in your career. And it could be that you look at your siblings and you see what they're doing and you have a sense of inadequacy.
又可能因為你嘅事業啦，或者你嘅教養背景，又或者你兄弟姊妹咧做到好多嘅嘢咧，令你覺得自己都唔係幾夠班嘅。
And maybe the area that for some of you is that you feel spiritually inadequate.
可能甚至到侍奉上邊，你都覺得自己靈性有啲低落嘅。
You spend time with other people who know the scriptures far better than you.
同別人一齊嘅時候，你覺得佢哋又好似連聖經都熟過你咁。
Or you think to yourself, I can't do that ministry role because there are others who are more experienced or others who are more gifted than me.
你又或者會諗咧，呢份侍奉我搞唔掂嘅，因為有人比我更有經驗啦，更有恩賜。
Now, I don't know where you feel inadequate, but I do know that in the short series we're going to be doing over the next few weeks, is quite relevant to all of us who wrestle with our feelings of inadequacy.
我唔知你喺邊方面覺得自己冇乜本事啦，但係喺未來幾個星期嘅講道系列裏邊咧，我哋對呢啲覺得自己冇乜用嘅人咧係好適切嘅。
As I believe that every one of us has a calling of God to be used of Him in some way.
因為我相信神呼召我哋一定喺某方面咧可以使用我哋嘅。
So I want to start this series today by looking at the story of Esther.
今日我想用以斯帖嘅故事咧嚟到做一個開始嘅。
Now Esther's story is told in a book in the Old Testament by her name.
以斯帖記喺舊約裏邊咧係講以斯帖嘅故事。
And chapter 1 of Esther tells us that King Xerxes is the king over all the Persian Empire.
以斯帖記第一章話俾我哋聽啦，亞哈隨魯王咧係波斯嘅皇帝。
Now there are actually 127 provinces. It was the most powerful empire in the world at that time, and it made Xerxes the most powerful man in the world, and he knew it.
當時波斯咧127個省喺全世界最強盛嘅國家，而亞哈隨魯王咧亦都知道自己就係全世界最有權勢嘅人。
And he even throws a party for himself that lasts for 180 days.
佢開咗個宴會咧係180日咁長嘅。
And after those 180 days, the king says, let's go 7 more days.
為咗表揚自己180日之後咧，佢話我哋再玩多7日咧。
And invites everyone from Susa with an open bar, and everyone can have as much as they want.
佢請晒書珊城所有嘅人啊，任飲任食。
And then on the 7th day of the party, the scriptures tell us that the king was in high spirits, and he sends from some of his men to get Queen Vashti, his wife.
喺宴會嘅第7日咧，聖經話皇帝咧好開心、好興奮，佢於是咧就使人咧叫呢個皇后出嚟，呢個皇后叫做雅實提嘅。
And he says, bring her out wearing the royal crown.
佢仲話要皇后咧係戴上佢皇后嘅冠冕出嚟。
Nothing but the royal crown.
其他乜都唔使戴。
Because the scriptures tell us that he wanted all the men to gaze on her beauty, because Queen Vashti was a beautiful woman.
因為聖經話俾我哋聽，所有嘅人咧都可以睇到佢呢個皇帝想睇到皇后嘅美貌，因為咧佢係容貌甚美嘅。
Well, I shall have nothing to do with that. So when they come to get her, she refuses the king's request.
咁皇后梗係唔肯制啦。當啲人去叫佢嘅時候，佢拒絕咗皇上嘅邀請。
And so King Xerxes banishes Queen Vashti from the kingdom and makes a law that she is never ever to come back.
於是亞哈隨魯王呢就罷免咗呢個皇后雅實提，於是呢立法以後都唔俾佢翻轉頭嘅。
Now 4 years later, we find in chapter 2 Xerxes is very sad. He's depressed, he's lonely, his harem is no substitute for his wife.
4年之後呢，亞哈隨魯王佢呢好憂傷、好抑鬱，更加好孤單。佢甚至到佢啲妃嬪呢冇一個可能取代到皇后嘅位置。
And his advisors see what is happening, so they come up with a plan. Let's have a beauty pageant across the whole kingdom, and the most beautiful girl in the empire will become your wife and queen.
咁佢啲侍臣睇見皇帝咁就獻計話，不如我哋搞個全國嘅選美大會啦，最靚嘅靚女呢就可以做你嘅皇后啦。
And Esther 2:4 says the advice appealed to the king, so he followed it.
以斯帖記2章4節話王呢好開心有呢個建議，於是佢就照做啦。
So we have all these beautiful women being rounded up from all the provinces and being brought to the citadel in Susa.
於是各省嘅年輕靚女呢聚集一齊呢送到去書珊城嗰度。
But before each girl's turn to go before King Xerxes, she has to complete 12 months of beauty treatment prescribed for the women, so that she would be the perfect specimen for the king when he sees her.
每一個少女當佢未見亞哈隨魯王之前呢，先要接受呢指定12個月嘅美容護理，等皇帝呢可以到時呢睇到佢哋最美嘅一面。
Well, amongst these beautiful women is a young girl called Esther.
咁呢啲靚女之中呢，有一個少女叫做以斯帖。
And Esther is a Jewish orphan who has been raised like a daughter by her cousin Mordecai.
以斯帖係一個猶大嘅孤兒，佢個表哥末底改呢當佢係女咁一樣湊大佢。
And Mordecai had been a Jewish man who had been taken into captive from Jerusalem under the siege of King Nebuchadnezzar.
末底改係個猶大人，當尼布格尼撒王呢圍攻耶路撒冷嘅時候呢，佢係被擄嘅。
And now he's one of the many displaced Jews kind of scattered throughout the region.
現在佢係好似一般亡國嘅猶大人一樣，散居喺郊野。
Now Mordecai is a really good man.
而末底改佢係真係一個好人。
He cares deeply for his cousin Esther and has protected her, and is why he instructs her to keep her family background, her Jewish heritage, a secret.
佢好好照顧咁佢嘅表妹以斯帖，時時保護佢、教導佢，而以斯帖呢亦都好聽話嘅。
And so she does.
而佢又亦聽晒佢講啦。
Now God has given all of us different gifts, and has given us different assets to be used for His purposes.
神俾我哋咧唔同嘅恩賜、唔同嘅資產，等我哋咧可以去使用我哋。
And the scriptures here in Esther 2:7 tells us that Esther had a lovely figure and was beautiful.
以斯帖記2章7節，聖經話俾我哋聽，以斯帖係容貌俊美嘅。
And so when the king meets her, he's smitten by her.
咁當皇帝見到佢嘅時候咧，就迷戀佢啦。
Of all the women in the kingdom, Esther is crowned Miss Persia, and they're married, and King Xerxes declares it's a national holiday.
全國所有嘅女士，以斯帖呢都係被冠為波斯小姐，佢嫁咗俾佢做皇后。亞哈隨魯王呢，亦都宣布當日嘅日子呢係一個公眾假期。
Now remember, the king has no idea that she is Jewish.
但係唔好忘記，皇帝完全唔知佢係猶大人。
No one knows of her nationality or her family background of this humble orphan girl now become queen.
冇人知道呢個卑微嘅孤女呢，而家成為皇后，但係呢，佢嘅背景國籍真係冇人知嘅。
And soon after they're married, the scriptures record what initially seems an insignificant story.
佢哋結婚咗之後呢，聖經記述咗一個好似冇乜特別嘅故事，
Involves Esther's cousin Mordecai, who has raised her.
就係關於以斯帖嘅表哥末底改嘅。
One day at the king's gate, where Mordecai hung out a lot, he overhears two palace guards talking about an assassination plot to to kill King Xerxes.
有一日咧喺皇宮門外咧，末底改時時喺嗰度流連嘅。佢聽到兩個守衛密謀話要暗殺亞哈隨魯王。
So Mordecai sends a message to Esther, who in turn tells the king, giving all the credit to Mordecai.
末底改於是咧報信俾以斯帖啦，以斯帖就話俾皇上聽，於是咧末底改就領晒功啦。
And the plot is thwarted, and the two would-be assassins are executed.
於是咧陰謀被揭露啦，兩個刺客咧被處死嘅。
Nobody makes a big deal about what Mordecai has done. There doesn't seem to be any big thank you or rewards.
但係冇人咧記得末底改立咗嘅功勞，亦都咧冇人獎賞佢，或者咧向佢講啲感恩嘅説話。
But they do write Mordecai's name down in the king's records, in the annals.
但係當時咧末底改個名咧係有記錄喺帝王嘅歷史冊上面嘅。
And later, that's going to become a very important part of the story.
咁當然呢件事咧成為後來我哋故事重要嘅一部分。
And then sometime later, in chapter 3, Xerxes needs some help with administering the kingdom.
後來咧喺第3章裏邊話俾我哋聽，亞哈隨魯王咧需要有人管理國家嘅政事。
So he hires an inside man as the highest ranking official in the kingdom, and this man's name is Haman.
佢咧於是指派咗一個佢親信叫做哈曼嘅人咧，去擔當全國最高嘅爵位。
He hires him as prime minister.
佢派佢做宰相。
But Haman is an evil man.
但係哈曼係個壞人。
He is a racist, and he hates the Jews.
佢係一個種族主義者，佢憎恨猶大人。
He is so addicted to power and in love with himself that he in fact demands that every person who walks by him must bow down and kneel before him.
佢沉迷權勢，而且咧好自大，每個人行過咧，個個佢都要佢哋咧喺度跪拜佢嘅。
And everyone fears Haman so much that they all bow down except one man, because he believes only bowing down to God.
人人都好驚哈曼嘅，都拜佢嘅，只有一個人冇拜佢，因為咧呢個人咧係單一拜上帝嘅啫。
And of course that person is Mordecai.
當然呢個人就係末底改啦。
And this makes Haman so furious he wants to kill Mordecai.
於是咧哈曼咧好嬲，佢就想殺末底改啦。
But he doesn't want to stop there.
但唔單止咁喎。
He puts together a proposal that all Jews in the entire empire are to be exterminated.
佢仲計劃咧要滅絕全國境內嘅猶大人。
So Haman goes to King Xerxes and he says, King, I'll give you lots of money if you let me wipe out this group of people we have here in Persia who don't belong here and who don't fit in.
因為哈曼於是去同亞哈隨魯王話：佢話王啊，我俾好多錢你，只要你咧俾我剷除喺波斯境內嘅呢一族嘅猶大人，反正佢哋咧唔係呢度嘅人啦，佢哋又唔守你嘅規矩嘅。
We need to eliminate them.
我哋要滅絕佢哋。
So King Xerxes says, okay, whatever you want, and you can keep your money.
亞哈隨魯王話：你想點就點啦，錢都唔使俾我。
Remember, nobody knows of Esther's background or her story.
記住，冇人知道咧，皇帝呢一個皇后咧係冇人知道佢嘅背景嘅。
So Haman King Xerxes says, okay, whatever you want, and you can keep the money. And so in the month of April, they cast lots, and they roll the dice to see what would be a good day on the calendar to annihilate the Jews.
於是哈曼咧喺4月嗰陣時咧，佢哋抽籤擇日咧就要滅絕啲猶大人啦。
And they land on March the 7th, which was 11 months later.
於是抽出11個月後嘅3月7號。
So the order goes out that all Jews, young and old, women and children, must be slaughtered on the March the 7th of the following year.
於是下令到時咧，所有嘅猶大人，無論老少、婦女、孩子都好，全部都要被屠殺。
It was just an horrific, evil plan of mass genocide hatched from the criminal mind of this evil man.
呢一個滅族嘅大屠殺咁嘅毒計咧，係出自呢一個惡人。
When Mordecai hears about this plan, he begins to wear sackcloth and he goes into mourning, for he is weeping and wailing when he sends word back to Esther that she's got to go to the king.
當末底改聽到呢個陰謀嘅時候，佢就穿上麻衣，大大嘅悲哀，而且咧痛哭報信俾以斯帖聽，叫佢去見皇上嘅。
He's got to do something about this.
佢話：以斯帖，你一定要做啲嘢。
And Esther sends back a message which basically says, I can't do that. Everyone knows that to go before the king uninvited is against the law and the punishment is death.
所以以斯帖回覆佢話：喂，我唔掂㗎，皇上有例，如果冇蒙召咧，我擅自走入去咧，會被處死嘅。
And the only exemption is if the king holds out the golden scepter as an invitation. And I don't see that happening because we've been married for 5 years and the king hasn't asked for me for 30 days.
佢話：除非皇上咧伸出呢個金杖召我，但係我睇佢都唔會啦，因為我哋結咗婚5年咧，皇上30日嚟都冇召過我啦。
So it isn't good for me to reveal my secret heritage or to ask for any favours.
所以而家梗係唔係時機去表露我嘅身份或者去求咩情啦。
Remember the last queen that didn't follow protocol? This was way too risky. This was way too much to ask of me, she says.
你記唔記得上一次嗰個皇后佢違例，佢嘅收場係點啊？我咁做太危險啦，我唔得㗎。
And then Mordecai sends this reply to Esther.
於是末底改就話啦，佢話：你唔好以為喺皇宮裏邊你強過一切猶大人，得免這禍。此時呢，你若閉口不言，猶大人必從別處得解脱，蒙拯救，你和你父家必至滅亡。
That's not exactly what Esther was expecting to hear from Mordecai.
以斯帖呢，諗唔到末底改會咁講嘅。
Because Mordecai is reminding her that even though she is the queen, living in a plush, sheltered life on the inside of the palace with housekeepers and servants, she is still Jewish.
末底改提醒以斯帖話：雖然你係皇后，皇宮裏邊咧你有管家有工人，過住奢華得寵嘅生活，但係你依然係一個猶大人。
And this decree applies to her also.
所以呢個法例呢，甚至到佢哋每一個人同埋佢哋嘅親人都要被處死。
And then Mordecai gets her to think about the purpose of her life.
末底改就係想以斯帖諗下佢生命嘅目的。
The purpose of why God put her in this world. And he says, who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this.
末底改於是話：佢話就係神擺你喺世上呢個目的，喺4章14節裏邊話：焉知道你得咗皇后嘅位份，唔係為咗現今嘅機會嘛？
Mordecai is saying to his young cousin, don't ever underestimate where God has placed you.
末底改係話俾佢嘅表妹知道，唔好忽視神放你喺呢個位置。
Perhaps this is why you have risen from being an orphan to become queen.
可能呢個就係你從孤兒變成皇后嘅原因啦。
God has orchestrated all of this to save his people.
神策劃一切，使到你可以咧救佢嘅子民。
Now is the time, Esther. We need you. This is your moment, and if you miss this God-ordained moment, well, he'll find other ways that he can get this done.
時機到啦，以斯帖，我哋係需要你嘅，呢個係你嘅機會。如果你錯過咗神設定嘅時機，神都有佢自己另外嘅方法去搞掂嘅。
But if you miss your moment, your chance to be part of it, who knows, maybe you have come to your royal position for such a time as this.
唔好失去參與呢個嘅機會，好可能你榮升皇后就係為咗呢一刻。
You see, Mordecai remembers the time when God made a promise centuries before to Abraham.
其實末底改咧係紀念緊神幾百年前對亞伯拉罕嘅應許，
That he would bless the whole world through the Jewish nation.
就係神會藉着猶大國咧去使到萬國得福。
That a Saviour for the entire world would come through them.
全地嘅救主係會由佢哋裏邊而出。
So he knew that somehow in the long term that God would accomplish his plan.
所以咧，佢知道神遲早係會成就佢自己嘅計劃。
He'd promised that.
神係應承咗噶嘛。
But what happens is that Esther would miss out on the incredible work of fulfillment and the life purpose that God wants to do in her life.
但係以斯帖呢，咁就可能錯失咗神俾佢嘅生命，去到實踐神奇妙嘅計劃。
You see, instead of being overwhelmed and overcome with inadequacy, she could stand with courage.
但係佢冇因為自己嘅卑微而放棄咗，佢勇敢嘅咁企出嚟。
And friends, this is true for every one of us.
其實我哋每個人都應該係咁做啦。
Whether you're a new parent or the parent of a preschooler or a primary schooler or high school student, that can be scary these days.
如果你係啱啱生咗 BB 啦，又或者你有仔有女讀緊小學、中學嘅時候，呢啲都係令到你有啲驚驚地嘅。
Be courageous because God has placed you in that boy's life, in that girl's life for such a time as this.
你唔使驚，神就係為咗現今呢個機會擺你喺你個仔同你個女生命裏邊。
If you're a boss or a business leader and things are a little scary right now, a little bit tight, a little bit uncertain, especially during this pandemic, perhaps you are the high integrity leader for such a time as this.
如果你係一個老闆啦，或者一個公司行政人員，而家呢銀根緊，生意難做，仲有呢個疫情添，都樣樣都唔穩定，仲有啲驚驚地。又或者呢，你係守誠信原則嘅領隊人啦，你就係因為咗現今嘅機會，喺呢一個時刻你喺呢度。
If you're a high school or a university student, you are in that school or on that campus for such a time as this.
如果你係讀緊中學或者大學咧，你喺校園裏邊就係為咗現今呢一個機會。
Maybe you sense that God is asking you to do something in your life, and it seems too big of a task to ask.
或者你覺得神係要你做啲嘢咧，你覺得好難啊。
It would make you feel uncomfortable, but you may be the man or the woman or the church for such a time as this.
可能你覺得哇唔係好舒服啊咁做，但係為咗現今嘅機會，你就係最適合嘅人，或者咧甚至到我哋係最適合嘅教會。
You see, Esther had a choice, and we have a choice.
以斯帖佢係有得揀嘅，而我哋亦都有得揀嘅。
Courage is always a choice.
而勇氣咧，永遠都係一個選擇。
And so after hearing Mordecai's such a time as this speech, there's a shift in Esther.
聽咗末底改呢個現今機會嘅訓話之後咧，以斯帖就有改變啦。
And so she sends back a message to Mordecai to have the Jewish people to fast and pray for her for 3 days.
於是佢回話俾末底改聽，佢話叫所有嘅猶大人為佢呢3日3夜禁食祈禱。
Never ever underestimate the importance of having people pray for you when you need some courage.
當你需要勇氣嘅時候，千祈唔好低估咗別人為你祈禱嘅力量。
For prayer brings clarity and hope.
祈禱為你帶嚟清晰感同埋有盼望嘅。
It's about seeking after God and His direction and His grace and His power to be courageous, to do what He calls to do in our lives and as a community of faith.
我哋作為一個信仰群體，我哋係要尋求神嘅指引、神嘅恩典、神嘅大能，俾我哋有勇氣去做佢叫我哋去成就嘅事。
And so after asking for prayer, Esther tells Mordecai this.
於是咧，以斯帖叫咗末底改去為佢祈禱嘅時候咧，就咁講啦。佢話：你當去招聚書珊城所有嘅猶大人，為我禁食3晝3夜，不吃不喝。我和我嘅宮女亦都要咁樣禁食。然之後咧，我違例入去見王，我若死就死吧。
She goes from this being too big a task, that this is way too risky, that this is too much, to Mordecai is right. Perhaps this is the reason I'm right here, right now, and if I perish, well, so be it.
以斯帖佢由心裏邊諗話太危險啦，呢件嘢太大件事啦，轉化為末底改，你講得啱。而家呢個係我嘅時間，喺呢度 就係我嘅原因，死就死吧。
We might be sitting here today full of regret for the opportunities we may have missed.
我哋今日坐喺呢度，好可能咧後悔緊，我哋錯失咗好多嘅機會。
For all the times that we've chosen comfort over courage in our lives.
我哋時時都係揀舒服，冇勇氣去面對一切。
But I'm saying to you this morning that you could be just one brave decision away from the most significant adventure of your life.
但係你可能只要做一個勇敢嘅決定，你就會有一個咧最有意義嘅生命嘅歷奇。
Esther said these powerful words, "If I perish, then I perish."
以斯帖真係好勁啊！佢話：我死就死吧。
It could be your worst fear. It could be a current fear. It could be a reoccurring fear.
呢啲可能係你一生最懼怕嘅事，可能咧發生喺你目前，又可能咧不住喺你生命裏邊恐嚇你。
Let me tell you what our enemy wants us to think about fear and anxiety.
讓我話俾你聽，我哋嘅敵人想我哋點睇呢恐懼咧？
He wants us to focus on it.
佢哋想我哋專注恐懼，
He wants it to mess with us.
佢去騷擾我哋。
He wants us to start believing that we can't do things or that we are inadequate.
佢等要我哋以為自己咧係冇用嘅，我哋搞唔掂嘅。
But even if my worst fear happens, then God will be there.
但係就算最差嘅事情發生喺我身上面，神係會喺度嘅。
He will be enough for me.
佢喺度就足夠啦。
He will pick me back up.
佢會扶起我，
He will be my strength.
佢會成為我嘅力量。
He will be all that he says he is.
佢話係就係。
And he will do everything that he promises because my God is bigger than my biggest fear and anxiety, and I will trust him.
佢講得出就做得到，因為我嘅神係大過晒我一切嘅恐懼、憂慮都冇事嘅，我係會信靠佢。
So Esther takes this step of faith.
於是以斯帖就走出呢個信心嘅一步。
She walks uninvited into the presence of King Xerxes.
佢冇被召就走到亞哈隨魯王面前。
Can you imagine her walking down that hall knowing that with every fearful step she is potentially one step closer to death?
你可以想象到佢行入皇宮嘅時候，每一步都係驚心動魄，每一步都係更接近死亡。
Remember, no one comes uninvited into the presence of the king. That's a capital offense.
記住，擅自入去見皇帝嘅係一死罪嚟。
And as she comes into the view, the guards are ready to take her out before she can reach the king.
侍衛一見佢入嚟嘅時候，佢未見到皇上就已經要拉佢走啦。
But the king sees her dressed in royal robes, clothed in confidence.
但係當皇帝見到佢着住朝服，滿有信心嘅時候，
And he stops the guards and he holds out the golden scepter and he asks, "What is it, Queen Esther? What do you want? Just ask and it is yours. I will give you half of the kingdom."
於是佢就叫住個侍衛伸出金杖，就問皇后以斯帖：佢話你要乜嘢啊？你求乜嘢都得，就算國嘅一半我都俾你啊！
Esther must have thought, "Wow, this is getting off to a better start than I thought possible."
以斯帖梗係諗緊，哇！比我想象得好，比我想象嘅好得多喎。
So she says, "You know what? I'd love to have a banquet with you and Haman, just the three of us tonight."
咁於是佢就話：係啊，皇上，我預備咗個筵席咧，想請你今晚帶埋哈曼一齊，我哋食飯啦。
And he says, "Consider it done. See you at dinner."
王話：冇問題，我哋今晚食飯見啦。
So that night, just the three of them, Haman, the one who had come up with the plan to murder all the Jews, King Xerxes and Esther, all have a banquet.
咁嗰晚佢哋三個人，有一個設計謀害所有猶大人嘅哈曼啦，有亞哈隨魯王啦，同埋以斯帖三個人一齊飲宴嘅。
There the king asks her again, "What is it that you want, Esther? Ask and it'll be yours."
直上皇帝又再問以斯帖：話以斯帖你想求啲乜嘢？我乜都俾你。
She answers, "Why don't the two of you come back tomorrow night for another banquet?" And the king agrees.
以斯帖就話：佢話你哋兩位不如聽晚再嚟另一個筵席啦。咁王又同意喎。
Can you feel the tension building?
哇！大家覺唔覺得好緊張、好肉緊呢？
When is she going to ask?
佢幾時會問？
When is he going to find out that she's actually a Jew?
皇帝幾時先知道佢係猶大人呢？
Well, Haman leaves the banquet that night full of himself. He's thinking, I'm really in. I'm having dinner with the royal family 2 nights in a row.
哈曼離開宴會之後咧，就自我膨脹，心諗話：唉，我掂啦！今次連續2晚我都同皇家人食飯喎。
But as he's leaving the banquet, he walks past Mordecai at the king's gate, who is still refusing to bow down to Haman, and it infuriates him.
但係當佢臨走嘅時候，經過朝門，見到末底改依然唔肯跪拜哈曼嘅，哈曼就梗係嬲到爆啦。
And when he gets home to his wife and friends that night and tells them, they say, have a gallows built 75 feet high tonight and ask the king tomorrow to have Mordecai hanged on it.
佢翻屋企就同佢老婆同啲朋友一齊就講啦，咁佢哋就話：佢話今晚你不如起個刑架75尺高嘅，聽日求王咧就將末底改掛喺上邊咪得咯。
And then go to the banquet and be happy.
之後就可以開開心心去食飯啊嘛。
Because he had no idea that Mordecai and Esther were related.
當然佢完全唔知道末底改同埋以斯帖係親戚嚟。
And so that night they began building the gallows so that Mordecai could be hanged the next day.
於是當晚佢哋就起咗個木架，第2日咧係用嚟吊死末底改嘅。
Now chapter 6 tells us that night while this is all going in, the king can't sleep.
第6章聖經話俾我哋聽，當晚咧皇上咧佢瞓唔着覺。
He's got insomnia, so he calls his attendants and he says, hey, will you get the minutes from the king's annals? I just want you to read me the minutes.
皇帝失眠，於是佢就叫啲隨從話：喂，去攞本王國嘅歷史記錄出嚟，你喺度讀俾我聽。
So they read through the minutes from 4 years back and they come across the story of a guy called Mordecai who saves the king's life.
咁於是佢哋就由4年前嘅記錄咧就讀起，讀到關於一個人叫做末底改，佢救咗皇帝一命嘅。
And the king decides, I need to honor this Mordecai.
於是王就決定，我一定要誇讚呢個末底改。
So the next morning, Haman comes walking into the king's office, and the king says, Haman, what should the king do if he really wants to honor somebody in the kingdom?
第2朝哈曼入皇宮，皇帝就問佢：喂，哈曼，如果皇帝要誇獎國內一個人嘅時候，佢應該點做呢？
Well, Haman, with his inflated ego, thinks obviously the king wants to honor him.
哈曼咁自大，佢就以為梗係皇帝咧要誇讚自己啦。
So he says, well, if you really want to honor someone, put them in a royal robe, put them on the king's horse, put a royal crest on his head and lead him through the streets for all to honor.
咁佢就話：如果真係要誇讚一個人咧，就賜一件黃袍俾佢，賜佢騎上呢個大冠冕嘅御馬，走遍全城去尊榮佢咯。
And the king says to Haman, excellent suggestion.
皇帝就話：哈曼，你好提議。
Quick, take the royal robes and my royal horse and do just as you said for Mordecai, the man who sits at the gates of the palace.
皇帝就話：快啲照你咁做，將個黃袍御馬賜俾坐喺城門口嘅末底改。
Imagine as Haman has to parade through the streets, leading Mordecai on a royal horse with a crown on his head, forcing everyone to pay honor to him.
你想象一下，哈曼竟然要親自拉住末底改坐緊嘅大冠御馬出去咧全城巡遊，同時咧仲要叫啲人咧去尊崇末底改。
In chapter 7, later that night, Haman and the king and the queen all sit down again for the banquet.
第7章話俾我哋聽，當晚哈曼同埋皇上、皇后咧坐低喺度飲宴。
And the king asks Esther again, what is your request? What is it that you want? Ask and it will be yours.
皇帝就再次問以斯帖，佢話：你想求啲乜嘢咧？要乜都得㗎。
She takes a deep breath, and with humility and courage, she says, I have found favor with you, then grant me this. I'm asking that you spare my life and the life of my people.
以斯帖唞一啖氣，佢謙卑勇敢咁話：佢話我如果喺王你面前蒙恩嘅，就求你饒我同埋我本族人嘅性命。
For they have been sold for destruction and slaughter and annihilation.
因為我哋將會被賣，要被剪除、殺戮、滅絕嘅。
And the king says, "Where is the man who would do such a thing?"
咁皇帝就話：邊處會有個咁嘅人做啲咁嘅嘢？
And Esther says, "He's right here. Haman is this wicked man."
以斯帖就話：佢就喺呢度咋，哈曼就係呢個惡人啦。
Well, the king is so angry with his highest-ranking official, he storms out of the room to catch his breath.
皇帝嬲到好犀利，離開咗酒席，佢衝出花園出去唞氣。
And realizing what is likely to happen, Haman rushes over to Esther and starts begging for his life. But he trips, and he falls on top of Queen Esther just as King Xerxes walks back into the room.
哈曼知道自己唔掂啦，今次就走過去求以斯帖咧救命。但係當亞哈隨魯王翻入嚟嘅時候咧，哈曼咁啱又撲倒跌喺皇后身上面。
Things are not looking good for Haman.
哈曼今次真係衰咗啦。
And then one of the attendants says, "King, I hate to interrupt you, but on the way here today, I passed Haman's house, and he has built a 75-foot gallows out in his yard to hang Mordecai on today, the guy who saved your life and raised your lovely queen."
一個隨從就對皇帝話：佢話對唔住啊，主上，我今日經過咗哈曼屋企咧，睇見佢起咗一個75尺嘅高刑架，要吊死呢個救王有功，又係咧湊大你皇后嘅末底改。
And so Xerxes says, "How convenient." And they go and execute Haman on the very gallows he prepared for Mordecai.
亞哈隨魯王就話：啱晒啦，用呢個架咧嚟咧為末底改起呢個架咧，我哋用嚟吊死哈曼啦。
Story goes on. Esther is given Haman's riches. Mordecai becomes the prime minister. The Jews are saved.
後來皇帝將哈曼嘅財富咧賜咗俾以斯帖，末底改咧上任為宰相，而猶大人就得到拯救啦。
I've taken a bit longer this morning, but it's a great story.
真係一個非常之好嘅故事。
Because some of us need to hear that story today.
今日我哋都需要聽呢個故事。
Because some of you look at your life and you feel so inadequate right now. Your career, your marriage, your kids, your education.
你睇下自己今日好似冇乜本事，你嘅事業啦、你嘅婚姻啦、你嘅兒女啦、你所受嘅教育啦，
And you don't like the situation you're in.
你又好不滿現狀。
And you wonder, where is God right now?
你諗緊話神喺邊度嚟啊？
You know, one of the most intriguing things about the book of Esther is the name of God is never mentioned in it.
好奇怪嘅，成本以斯帖記咧係完全冇提到神個名嘅。
It's the only book in the Bible that doesn't mention the name of God.
喺聖經裏邊，唯一本書係冇提及神個名嘅。
But friends, don't confuse God's name not being in it with God not being in it.
但係唔好搞錯啊，冇提神個名啫，但係並不表示神唔喺度嘅。
The hiddenness of God does not mean the absence of God.
隱蔽嘅神並非係冇神，
He is all over the story.
神係充斥咗整個故事裏邊。
God is in complete control of the story.
神係完完全全掌控緊成個嘅故事。
Could it just so happen that Vashti had banished at just the right time when Esther's at the right age to be picked for tryouts for the next queen?
係咪話雅實提係被貶之後咁啱以斯帖長成又可以選為下一個皇后呢？
Could it just so happen that amongst all the beautiful women coming to King Xerxes for 4 years, Esther, an orphaned Jewish girl, is chosen?
咁又係唔係4年前咁多嘅靚女之中，隨女王咁啱只係揀中猶大嘅孤女以斯帖呢？
And could it just so happen that the Jewish nation would be facing annihilation at the exact time that the queen happened to be Jewish?
咁又係唔係當猶大國幾乎被滅絕嘅時候，咁啱呢個猶大人又做咗皇后呢？
And could it just so happen that even though it was against the law and the king didn't have a toleration of disrespecting wives, Esther wins his favor?
咁係咪雖然皇上唔容許啲皇后唔尊重佢嘅，但係係咪咁啱以斯帖又得寵呢？
And could it just so happen that while a plot is being carried out to kill Mordecai, the king has a sleepless night and his bedtime story is about Mordecai who saves his life.
咁又係唔係當計劃謀殺末底改之前，皇帝咁啱又失眠，又咁啱咧佢聽到末底改救佢嘅故事咧？
And could it be that the gallows for Haman were already being built by none other than Haman himself?
咁又係唔係哈曼起呢個刑架咁啱咧？咁啱佢就用翻喺自己身上邊咧？
And could it just so happen that all of this would take place at a time when the Jewish community was scattered and displaced, and that they would come together and become strong again?
咁係咪呢件事發生在猶大被擄驅散咗之後，咁啱佢哋又可以有機會再次咧強盛復國呢？
Now, friends, that is God.
各位朋友，係神喺度做嘢，
That is God working behind the scenes in everything.
係神喺一切嘅事情後邊咧動緊工。
And God chose to inspire this book without his name being mentioned so that we could take courage.
神啟示嘅呢本書，佢特登唔想提佢自己個名，使到我哋咧係有勇氣嘅。
Maybe you have been in a season in your life when you can't figure out how God has been working, but then God has been all over it.
就可能喺你生命裏邊某一個時段，你搞唔清楚神究竟喺度做緊啲乜嘢，佢喺度點做法。
You only find that when you look back over it.
而家當你回望嘅時候，你見到神係掌管緊一切。
Or maybe you're in a season right now that for the life of you, you can't figure where God is in your story.
又可能你今時今日喺你生命裏邊，你搞唔清神喺邊一個方位，
You can't seem to find his involvement.
你又睇唔到佢喺邊度參與緊。
Well, I think God has given us this story of Esther so we can know that even when we can't see him on the page, he is there.
我諗神賜以斯帖呢個故事俾我哋今日，等我哋知道字裏行間佢係喺度嘅。
He is right where you are right now.
你喺邊度，佢就喺邊度。
Don't be afraid. Be brave. You are not alone.
唔使驚，要剛強壯膽。你唔係單獨一個人嘅。
If you and I are going to live with courageous lives, we need to know that we don't have to be the hero.
雖然你同我都係需要剛強壯膽，但係我哋係唔使去做英雄嘅喎。
God is already at work, and we only need to be willing to trust him. Who is at the work behind the scenes?
神佢已經喺背後動工，我哋只要願意咧信靠佢就得啦。
And say yes to the role that he's asking us to play, whether it be in our homes, whether it be in our workplaces, whether it be here at CBC.
佢指派俾我哋嘅角色，我哋只要話好，不論喺屋企、喺工場或者喺中浸呢度都係。
For such a time as this.
我哋只係要為咗現今呢個機會。
Amen.
神去利用你同我喺呢個世界裏邊作鹽作光，只要相信佢能夠帶領我哋就有呢份嘅勇敢。我哋願意一同起立去唱一隻詩歌《光和鹽》。
我是誰？願被桃花美淚，無味生命只剩一張嘴。我是誰？藏於斗底裏，安慰教人忘了我是誰。人點燈放在燈台上，把一室黑暗都照亮。願能更新披戴你形象，綻放馨香。 上的鹽和光，堅守真理不怕搖晃，像城建於山上，不能隱藏。倘若軟弱不能前往，警醒禱告趕快就光，願人能悔改，人間遇見天光，活出主的國。人點燈放在燈台上，把一室黑暗都照亮，願能更新披戴你形象，綻放馨香。我是世上的鹽和光，堅守真理不怕搖晃，像城建於山上，不能隱藏。倘若軟弱不能前往，警醒禱告趕快就光，願人能悔改，人間遇見天光，活出主的國。你是世代的鹽和光，擔起苦痛拯救萬邦，為羊捨身的愛導我豐盛啟航，走入世代作鹽和光，真理真愛給你傳講，願人能悔改，人間遇見天光，活出主的國。願人能悔改，人間遇見天光，復興主的國。
我哋一齊去領受從神而嚟嘅祝福。願主耶穌基督嘅恩惠、天父上帝嘅慈愛同埋聖靈嘅感動，都時時刻刻同我哋每一個人同在，直到永永遠遠。阿門。在神家裏盡獻真心不後退，互勉分擔，拋開憂慮，也送走疲累。願與你覓尋真理，立志跟基督步履，共你分享主恩滋味，這愛心中記。讓你將基督的愛奉獻世間到未來，攜手衝開黑暗悲哀，讓你將主恩高唱，願意此生去傳揚，唯願與你一起創天象。我哋都同身邊嘅弟兄姊妹講聲 hello， 多謝祝福。攜手衝開黑暗悲哀，我也將主恩高唱，願意此生去傳揚，唯願與你一起作天象。大家請坐。感謝神啊！我哋咧可以一齊咧去參加崇拜，一齊去敬拜神，一齊去學習神嘅話語。咁咧想問下有冇第一次嚟參加我哋粵語早堂崇拜嘅新朋友啊？如果有嘅時候，可唔可以請你舉舉手咧？喺我嘅左手邊有一位最後邊嘅，係好歡迎你，係啊，歡迎晒，係啊。咁樣咧，我哋送俾你咧有一個我哋介紹我哋教會嘅簡介嚇，咁樣咧就 希望咧係下個星期繼續咧可以同你一齊去參與我哋嘅崇拜。咁咧我哋有一啲嘅報告。咁首先咧就係我哋個奉獻啦。咁我哋無論係現金或者係網上嘅轉帳咧都可以咁大家咧都係我哋依時去奉獻啦，因為咧呢個都係神咧愛嘅邀請我哋一齊嘅嚟到去喺奉獻嘅當中咧去經歷神嗰個供應同埋神喺我哋生命裏邊嘅帶領。咁另外咧就係我哋嗰個下一個星期咧我哋嗰個嘅崇拜咧就早堂嘅崇拜咧，我哋就會係無論網上同埋實體咧，我哋係仍然會繼續。咁而下午堂咧，咁我哋知道咧，因為即係近日嗰個疫情個情況啦，咁係即係啱啱喺星期四嘅時候，咁就已經係超過2萬宗，咁所以咧教牧團咧就決定。咁下午堂咧，本來佢其實就由今日開始咧，佢哋就係開始翻個實體崇拜，但係即係現階段咧就係都係暫停嗰個嘅崇拜直至到另行通知。咁我哋嘅早堂嘅崇拜咧，咁我哋繼續紀念到我哋弟兄姊妹我哋侍奉嘅人員各方面求神咧嚟到係去加力去祝福佢哋。咁咧，仲有就係我哋下個星期咧係聖餐主日咁咧亦都係屆時咧，我哋有嗰個慈惠嘅奉獻，咁希望咧大家都係去預備好啦。咁另外咧就係我哋教會嘅停車場咧，由1月5號我哋咧啱啱就其實攞咗你嗰個新嘅2022年嘅泊車證不過咧就因為我哋嗰個灑水系統嘅緣故咧，咁所以我哋由1月5號開始，咁我哋由星期一至到星期五朝早7點至到下晝嘅5點鐘咧，就停車場咧係會停用嘅即係由1月5號開始，咁咧就係由星期一至五朝早7點至到下晝嘅5點鐘咧，咁我哋停車場係停用嘅，咁以便咧就係去因為咧去安裝嗰個灑水系統有好多嘅工具工程好多嘅嘢架剩咁樣咧就會係放喺嗰個停車場嘅裏邊，咁所以咧我哋係會呢段時間咧我哋係會一路咧都會係呢個時間咧我哋會關閉我哋嘅停車場。咁另外咧，亦都因應住呢一個灑水嘅工程嘅緣故啦，咁我哋大堂即係呢一個地方呢一個位即係我哋個大堂咧，就由1月10號至到1月22號咧，就係會關閉嘅，就係會係特別係喺我哋呢一個即係呢一個地方咧去做呢一個工程。咁而樂基堂咧，亦都會喺1月6號開始咧，就會暫停使用，直到另行通告。我再重複就係我哋嗰個主堂咧，就係由1月10號至到1月22號。咁如果大家去問咧，我俾個 idea 你，就係9號咧係我哋嘅崇拜嚟嘅，即係話9號咧我哋繼續可以用呢個地方，但係16號咧我哋就要係暫停去用呢個地方，我哋就要用網上咧嚟到係去進行咧我哋嗰個崇拜。咁同埋咧係23號咧就係我哋嗰個嘅主日崇拜嚟嘅，即係話23號咧我哋又會開放翻，係到22號係關閉咧係到22號。咁另外咧，我哋教會嗰個網上嘅祈禱會咧，咁呢個星期仍然係休假嘅。咁仲有咧就係我哋晨光關懷協會咧，其實有一連串嘅網上嘅講座都係好好嘅。咁特別推介2個喺今朝嘅時候。咁一個咧就係用粵語主講嘅，係從基督徒嘅角度去經歷憂傷和失落咁另外咧就係有一個係英語主講嘅，就叫做 Healthy Screen Time for Young Children。咁咧呢個 Young Children 個年齡咧係由0至到5歲嘅，咁呢個都係一個我相信咧，即係好多人咧都會係喺呢個時間咧，可能都會遇到想了解多啲，咁歡迎你咧就喺網上咧嚟到係去報名晨光嘅講座。咁另外咧其實仲有好多佢哋其他喺今年咧嘅講座，咁就歡迎大家咧親自去翻晨光關懷協會嘅網頁嘅裏邊咧去睇翻嗰啲嘅詳情。咁同埋大家咧，如果有任何代禱關懷嘅需要咧，咁歡迎你隨時去同我或者咧同阿譚傳道咧嚟到去聯絡。咁最後咧就今日係新年，咁祝大家咧新年快樂！我哋下個星期再見大家。